Hello guys, welcome to Bhavna's Online Academy. So in this video we are going to see the chapter number 4 of EIS, that is e-commerce, m-commerce and emerging technologies, and this is the part 2 of our chapter number 4 and the part 1 has already been uploaded. I'll link it in the I button here or in the description box below, so make sure to watch that video first and then jump into this video. And yes guys, so now let's move into the video.
Perfect. So now let's start with the class. So digital payments. So what are digital payments? As you already know that in today's world, okay, we hardly carry any cash with us. Before and all, if you used to go to a shopping mall or if you used to go to buy a grocery items and stuff like that, we used to carry proper amount of cash into our purse. Nowadays, we only carry like 100 or 200 rupees in our wallets, and the rest of the thing, we just know that we have our online digital apps through which we can make payment, through which you can make the payment if you run short of cash. Correct. So today, each one of us who is there in this class would have used any kind of 1 minute, guys. Yes, sorry. So we all would have used any one kind of digital payment. So it might be in the form of a Google Pay, Phone Pay, or net banking, or credit cards, or debit cards. Any other thing that is other than physical cash, we might have used a lot of digital ways to make payments. Okay. So this is now has become a part of our everyday life. So digital payments, which is also known as electronic payments. So in the exam, they're asking you a question about what is electronic payment. You must remember that that is nothing but your digital payment. Correct. So it is a way of payment which is made through digital modes. That is other than physical modes. If it is made through any other mode, it will come under this. There is no hard cash involved, and all the transactions will be completed online itself. Okay, when you are paying for your orientation or ITT or your exam fees, so basically everything what you do is online only. Everything is done in a digital mode only. Correct. So now first we will study what are the advantages and disadvantages of these digital payments. So advantage of digital payments, first it is very easy to use and very convenient, because what happens is, if now we have to go buy some gold, okay, and we cannot carry 3 lakh or 5 lakh rupees of hard cash with this, correct? So what can happen is, because if even if we carry and go, there might be a threat that it could be somebody might come and steal it from you, or you might leave it somewhere. So all of these things, keeping those in mind, now since we have everything digital, you can take your debit or credit cards and you can just swipe and come out, right? So it is very easy and very convenient today. Next is pay or send money from anywhere, right? From any part of the world, you can send it to anybody and anywhere. Okay, so if it is cash, then you two people have to meet at one place, okay, and there basically needs to be physical presence. But right now it is not like that. If today I have to send money, if I'm shopping from a website that is based out of USA, I don't have any problem, because what will happen is, from here itself, from India itself, I'll make a payment to them using the digital mode of payment. Okay. Next is discounts from taxes. So what happens is, government, to promote this digital payments, as you all know, the Modi government is very proactive in promoting these digital payments. So they have announced many discounts. Okay, so users get 0.75% discount on fuels and 10% discount on insurance premium whenever they pay using any digital mode. Next is a return record. So usually what happens is that whenever you have cash, okay, suppose you have 500 rupees as cash and you have 500 rupees in your Google Pay or Phone Pay or any of your online wallets. Okay. So what happens is that the 500 rupees that you have as cash, over a month, you will never know, like 10 rupees or 20 rupees or 50 and 100 rupees, how you would have spent it. You wouldn't have any track of it. Like you might be going on the road and you would have seen some nice drink or something and you would have got it for suppose 100 rupees. The other day you might be walking on the road and you would have seen a beggar and you would have offered them like 20 to 30 rupees. Okay, so you do not actually have a track of where all your money is going if you have it in a cash form. But whereas if it is online, even if you're going to send 1 rupee to your best friend when you join Google Pay for the first time, it is still going to be recorded. Correct. So each and every transaction is recorded here. Okay, so what happens? You do, since we have this record with us, it helps us to track our spending habits and how, and based on that, we can also plan the budget of the next month. Next is, it is less risky. Okay, so what they tell you is that if digital payment modes are used wisely and with all cautiousness, that you do not give out your OTP or your PIN anywhere else, then what happens is that it is less risky. Okay, next is competitive advantage to business. So what happens is that if there is usually a business, so what happens is normally if you go to any exhibition or so, and what happens, you like some product there. Okay, what now they tell you that this product has is going to cost you around 5,000 rupees, but in hand you only have 2,000 rupees. Now if there was no digital mode of payment, no debit card, no credit card, or no online payments, or no digital base for payments in general, then in such case that business would lose out on a potential customer that it had. But now since everything is digital, even if you don't have like hard cash in your hand, you always have your mobile phone or your cards with you. So using that, you can make your payment. So what happens if any business is having, if suppose a business is accepting digital mode of payment, then it provides a competitive advantage to them only, because it will be easier for them to make sales to customer who choose to pay electronically. Next is environment friendly. So here what happens is there is no use of paper. Okay, everything is digital, as you know. So these are the advantages. So that this, so the advantages you can remember in the form of a mnemonic, which is cleared. So here C for competitive advantage to business, L for less risk, E for environment friendly, A for anywhere. This pay or send money anywhere. So that anywhere is your A. R is your return record. So that will be your R. Another next E would be your easy and convenient, and D would be your discount from taxes. So this is your mnemonic for remembering the advantages of digital payment. This is such a simple answer. Okay. Even this was asked in the exam for 5 marks. So usually EIS is easy. Only that thing is that the more you are, revising it more, the more it will stick to your mind and it will be easier for you to write in the exam. Correct. Okay. Next is drawbacks of digital payment. So what are the drawbacks of digital payment? First is that it is difficult for a non-technical person to use it. Now today, if you go to your grandmas and tell them, grandpa or grandmas who usually don't use smartphones, for them, or the farmers or people who are not very literate about this digital world. So what will happen for them, making these payments or using this internet and using this digital world will be very difficult. So that is one drawback. Second drawback is risk of data threat. So what can happen is hijackers can hack the servers of the bank or a e-wallet. Suppose Paytm was once hacked by hijackers. Okay, multiple times hijackers have tried to, hackers, not hijackers, sorry. Hackers have tried to, hack through their, servers and database, everything, to get information and money. But even though multiple times of trying, they failed. But there was one time when they were able to go through their security systems, and they had taken out some amount of money and some amount of data from it. So that is a risky part about it. Correct. Next is overspending. So what happens here is that, see, if there is suppose a mobile phone, okay, and suppose you're getting a mobile phone of worth suppose 50,000 or 60,000 rupees, or we'll take 30,000 itself. Okay, that's the normal price that usually everybody pays. So 30,000. Now imagine you sending this or paying this 30,000 via a bank, or via your online payments. You will not know the value of 30,000 that you will just send it. Now imagine your dad coming and giving to you a bundle of 30,000 which consists of 500 rupee notes. Okay, so what will happen? How many notes will you have in your hand? 30,000 divided by 500, around 60 notes you would have in your hand, right? So here when you say 6,500 rupee notes, and that this much amount you are spending for just getting one phone, you will understand the value of money. So since everything is happening online, you also don't think twice between. Now you're late in the night, you're sleeping, you just place an order randomly somewhere, okay, out of the blue. So this overspending problem has come because everything is digital and people are not able to realize the worth of money that they're spending online. Next is disputed transactions. So what might happen is sometimes your electronics, this might have happened with many people, that in our GPay itself, there'll be two people with the same name. To send, suppose to party name, one is Sham, party name two is also Sham. Okay. So what happens is, now if you have to send money to a Sham, which is your school friend, you would mistakenly send to the Sham, who is your CA friend. So here what happens is that now the other person who is your CA friend, if he doesn't like you, he will not give you a refund and all, correct? So here this case might happen with that your money can be misused by someone and it will be very difficult to receive a refund from it. Next is increased business cost. So here what happens is, to set up this digital payment, they are talking about from the business point of view, from the Paytm point of view, from the Google Pay point of view, from their point of view, they have to incur additional cost in procuring, installing and maintaining the software or the security technologies that they have to put into place, correct? Next is the necessity of internet access. So if you have to make a digital payment, okay, you go to a shop, the same exhibition example we can take, you run short of money, but now if you do not have internet on your phone, or you do not have network coverage area around that exhibition, then at the end your cash is what is going to help you. Okay, so since internet access is so important, then that becomes a drawback of digital payment too. Okay, so these were the advantages and disadvantages of digital payments. Okay. Now we move on to the topic of what are the different types of digital payments. So there are two. One, they have split it into traditional methods, and the other one are modern methods. So first we'll go through our traditional methods. So under traditional method, first what you have are your cards. So you have your credit card, debit card and smart cards here. Yes. So what is, first we'll see what is a debit card. Okay, so what is a debit card? You would have all seen the debit card where the number of the card is written or where the username is written. And if you flip it the other side, you will have your CVV number written and the bank name written and all of those. So the debit card is a small plastic card with a unique number linked with the bank account. So you should have a, see, one thing that you have to remember is that if you want if you want to have a debit card, it is very important that you must have your bank account linked with it. You must first have a bank account, and then your bank account will be automatically linked with your debit card. So the concept of debit card is that in debit card you will only be able to utilize the money which you already have in your bank. Correct. So that amount of money only, if you have 500 in your bank, only up to 500 rupees you will be able to spend or purchase things. More than that you cannot. So it will be linked with your bank account number. It will also, debit cards also have a unique number, correct? So those numbers will be linked with your bank account number, and it is just a small plastic card, and how much ever you purchase, the amount keeps decreasing from your bank account directly. Okay. So here, that is the thing about debit card. I hope you understood that. Next is the major difference. So what is the major difference between debit card and credit card is that in debit card, what happens is the amount which you spend gets deducted from the card's bank account immediately. So if suppose you have a HDFC debit card, then that debit card, that is HDFC, your bank will, whatever you spend, the amount will be deducted from your bank account. Okay. And for that to happen, your bank should also have sufficient balance in it. Okay, or else it will show an error. Whereas in case of credit card, there is no compulsion of that. Okay, there's no compulsion that your bank account must have certain amount of money, X and X amount of money. Okay, so credit card I discussed now. So credit card is also a small plastic card which is issued by the bank. Here what happens is that it allows the holder to purchase goods and services on credit. On credit means you need not have that amount of money with you, but you can spend it. And usually what happens is that suppose they take a period of spending, suppose 1st to 25th of a month. So this in this 25 days, how much ever you have spent, you must pay it in the next 10 or 20 days, they will tell you. Okay. So there will be a limit on spending, but that depends on your credit score later on. But this is then, so how much amount you are spending in this 25 days, you have to next repay it to the bank in the next 10 or 20 days. So that is how it is work. So this also has a unique number and it is linked with an account. Okay. Next is buyer's cash flow is not immediately impacted. So here, whether when you take about debit card, in debit card, I told you how much money you have in bank, only that amount of money you will be able to spend. Whereas credit card is not like that. So here what happens is the buyer's cash flow, that means how much cash he's spending, it will not get affected here, immediately affected here. Okay. Next is card payments to card issuer at the end of billing cycle. That's what I told you. At the end of billing cycle, in the next 20 to 20 days or 50 days, you have to make payment. This about this credit card in chapter number 5 we are going to discuss in detail. Okay. Yes. So that was your credit card and your debit card. Next, you have something known as smart card. But before we move on into smart card, there is one more kind of card that I would like to tell you. You would have used your metro cards, or if you have gone to Fun City, there they issue a Fun City card, or you use your food court card also. So what these cards are is, suppose now if you go to any mall and if you have a food court, for people who don't know what is a food court, what happens is when you enter a mall, in one place, in one floor, they'll have a lot of food shops nearby. Okay, a lot of food stalls nearby. So what happens is, once a user enters here, if the user, suppose this is your Domino's, and this is your McDonald's, and this is your KFC, then if you want to eat from each shop, then you have to go to each shop, make payment and get the order, make payment, get the order, make payment, get the order, and that will become a very tedious task, and it will also take a lot of time, because you have to see how much money you have, what change they have to give, and all of those stuff. So to avoid these, what they have done is they set up one what do we say, one particular shop or one particular stall, where here what they do is, the customer can first enter and directly come here, and he can make a recharge. Okay, he can make a recharge of, suppose he wants to spend 1,000 rupees, then he can make a recharge and give it to the and tell this to the person that I need a recharge of 1,000. So this person will in turn issue a card, and in that card, suppose for issuing that card, he might have taken 50 rupees. So 950 rupees he'll recharge in this card and give it to the customer. So this customer can go to each shop and spend and eat there. Okay, and at the end, if suppose, I don't know at how many places this happens, but if he suppose has only spent 800 rupees, the remaining 150 plus the 50 rupees of card, if it is the card has been given back to the person or the owner itself, this 200 rupees will get refunded to you, what you have not used. So these are the other kinds of cards. In Metro also you have this recharge card. Same in Fun City also. If you want to play games, you first need to go and recharge that card, and using that recharged card, you can go and play games, and the same happens in a food court card. So this is a kind, also this is a very tiny version of smart card. But what actually smart cards are is, smart card is also a prepaid card, wherein earlier itself you fill in money into that. Okay. So this will be similar to credit card and debit card in appearance. So here what happens is, there is a small microprocessor chip which is embedded in that smart card. A small microprocessor chip is being embedded into the smart card. So what the smart card will do is, it will have personal information of the customer, such as the financial facts, private encryption keys, credit card information, account information, all of these personal information about the customers, that will be there in the smart card. Okay, so here what happens is that these smart cards are not linked to any bank account. Okay, so this will not be linked to any bank account. In this, what you will do is, you will recharge it first itself, and wherever you want to spend, you will go on spending in that certain shops. So this is used to store money, which is reduced as per your usage. As and when you spend money, this money from this recharge card will get reduced. Okay, examples are Mondex and Visa cash cards. Okay. Yes, this is not very common in India as of now. Okay. So next is internet banking. So this is also one of the traditional methods, where what happens is that once a customer goes and opens his bank account, he will have to fill up a form. Once he fills up a form of internet banking and gives it to the bank will in turn provide them a login ID and password. So what basically this is that, see, nowadays nobody likes to go to the bank and stand there and use their services for money transferring, or for credit card creation, or for a debit card creation. People usually now don't want, everything they want is from the comfort of their homes. So the same applies to bank also. Why would bank want a 500 customers standing there, they're standing there daily in front of their own banks, right? They wouldn't want that. So here what they have done is, they have created the same offline bank which is there. Now it is going to come on online. So this is nothing but online banking, or what you call it as your internet banking. So all the functions that you do in an offline bank, you can perform it in the online bank also. Example, if you have to, get a credit card or debit card, or if you have to transfer money to someone. So things like that. So, okay, so internet banking, so customers can log on to his or her bank account. So if you go online and if you put your login ID and password, it will log in into your bank and you can make payments using that. So now what happens, all public sector, large private sector banks, everybody is now allowing net banking facilities to their customer. Okay. Yes, so these were the traditional methods. What are the traditional methods? Cards and internet banking. So you have credit card, debit card, smart card, and internet banking. Next, what we are going to study is the new methods of digital payments. What we are going to study is the new. Any doubts until this case? Can we move on to the next topic of new methods? We have completed the advantages, disadvantages, and the traditional methods. Okay, if there is any doubt, let me know. Yes, so new methods of digital payment. So here now they have given you a lot of new methods by which right now the digital payment is happening, and we will see all of these one by one. Okay, so here you have first what you have is your UPI apps. How many people have not used any UPI app until now, or what is the most use the UPI app that you have on your phone? So examples would be your Phone Pay, your Google Pay. So any app which is directly linked to your bank accounts, and whenever you make whenever you make a payment, you have not used. Okay, then I think I'll explain this in a bit detail. Okay, fine. See, people have I've got an answer of GPay. So here what happens is that basically for the person who have not used this, you basically have a mobile app. And what happens in this mobile app is you can go into this app and you have to link your bank account, and you have to go link your bank account. Once you have linked your bank account, what will happen is this mobile app will provide you with a unique username. Suppose my username can be Bhavna at HDFC, suppose. Okay, so it will provide me with a unique username, and what can happen is using this particular app, I can make payments to the people I want to. Okay, so how will I be able to make payments is that one, I can to whoever I want to transfer the particular amount, I can use their phone number to make their payments. Okay, if I put in their phone number, and if in there, suppose I'm using a mobile app called as GPay. Okay, now what will happen is in the other person's phone, if there is GPay, if I put in their mobile number, then to their GPay account or to their bank account directly, the money will get transferred. So when I'm making a money transfer from GPay, suppose if I'm sending 1,000 rupees, this 1,000 rupees will directly get deducted from my bank account. And when I am sending to this particular phone number to whichever bank account it has been linked to, in that bank account, that 1,000 rupees will go and get credited. Okay, next, the second method you can use is you can put in the bank account details. Okay, or third one, what you can do is you can scan a QR code. Okay, so if you open this phone, here a QR code will come, and from this phone you can scan this QR code and you can make payments to this particular bank account or to this particular UPI. Okay, yes. So, and if you are, suppose if there is an online website, if there is suppose Amazon, and in Amazon, if you have come to your payment details right now, and here you want to make payment using your UPI ID, what you can do is you can go and give your UPI ID, that is Bhavna at HDFC. So if you give this, you know that this is particularly linked to which phone number and which mobile app, or I mean which bank account, because this is a unique ID, correct? If you put in this, directly the request will come into your UPI ID or UPI app, and here if you click accept, then the money will, you have to give your PIN and other things. So if you accept that you want to make a payment, then the payment will be made to Amazon. Okay, so I've just given you a brief understanding about how UPI apps work. So here you don't need any kind of cash. Unlike wallets, you don't need any cash here, and directly this is linked to your bank account, and all the transaction processing happens using your bank account only. So UPI ID, so UPI means Unified Payment Interface. UPI means Unified Payment Interface. That means all the payments, it is unified at one place, and it is a platform or an interface for that. Okay, so here the payment mode is, one second. Yes. So here the payment mode which is used to make instant fund transfer from sender's bank account to receiver's bank account. You can make instant payment here using the mobile app. Correct. So here, what is the process? First, you need to download the UPI app. Then you have to create a unique ID, or what we call as UPI ID or VPA. VPA means your virtual payment address. So my Bhavnat HDFC was my VPA, that is virtual payment address. Or you can also call it as UPI ID. So once you have created that, you can register for mobile banking to use UPI apps. Okay, so once you have done that registration, you can link your bank account and finally you can transfer your funds. So this is about your UPI app. So UPI apps example is your PhonePe, GPay. Okay. Next, what you have is immediate payment service. So IMPS. So here what happens is that here this is this is the interbank electronic fund transfer. Okay, so using your internet, what you can do is you can transfer amount from one bank account to another bank, from one bank account to another bank account electronically using your internet basically, and instantly if you want to transfer through your mobile phones, you can do this. If this is done, then this will be known as your IMPS. Okay, your immediate payment service. So here this examples for this is nothing but your internet banking and your ATM. Okay, fine. This is the mobile internet banking using your mobile, which you can do. Correct. Next is your mobile apps. So mobile apps, one example, one they have specifically taken here is especially is your Bheem, that is your Bharat interface for money. So this, as you know, we already spoke about PhonePe and Google Pay. So who is the owner of PhonePe? PhonePe's owner is Flipkart. Who is Flipkart's owner? Walmart. So this is a foreign entity. If you take Google Pay also, or GPay also, GPay is what do we say? GPay is a holder, or the owner of GPay is Google. So Google is also a foreign entity. So then our Indian people thought, why not we make something which is made in India? Why don't we make a app which is made in India? And then that's when they came out with the app which was known as BHIM. Once again. Yes. BHIM, Bharat. So Bharat interface for money. Okay, so this is the same, this way works samely as your PhonePe and GPay only. So this was developed by the National Payments Corporation of India. E-payments directly through bank and supports all Indian banks which use their platform. Okay, so here this is nothing. This is the same as your IMPS, okay, which we studied earlier, immediate payment service infrastructure. Here you can transfer the money to the user instantly itself. Okay, here what you can do is you can transfer money to another user by scanning their QR code, or you can give their IFSC code and send it, or you can use something known as MMID and send it. So what happens is usually, once again, so usually the bank accounts which are there, they must be UPI friendly. Almost all our banks are UPI friendly today. That's why we are able to link our UPI to the bank accounts. Now, there might be a few banks which are not supporting the UPI and they are not UPI friendly. So here what can happen is, here to identify which bank or which user you are specifically, what they do is they create a unique code which is known as the MMID code, or what we say is as mobile money identifier code. Okay, so using this code, a unique code is given to each user. Okay, and by this code, they will be able to identify which account in which bank account the user has, and using that code, you can transfer money. So see, if there is a recipient who does not have a UPI enabled bank account, then in such case, money can be sent using the Bheem app, and you have to, in that Bheem app, you have to use the MMID and send the money to them. Okay, so I hope you understood this also. That was about your Bheem. Next is your mobile wallet. Mobile wallet is very simple, like how you have an offline wallet in which you have a lot of money. The same way, if the same money is getting stored online, this will be known as your online wallet. Here, this and all, it's not important that it should be linked to bank account and all. No, it's just what you do is using your bank account to a wallet. It is like a digital wallet. How you have like a photo album you have in real life, and in your mobile phone you have your gallery. Correct. So like that only, how you have your mobile wallet, you have your real wallet in your phone also, you can have a mobile wallet. And using that mobile wallet, say example, if Paytm also you take, no, the older version of Paytm, now they have the linking to bank accounts, but older version of Paytm was a perfect example of an online wallet, that in that wallet you can recharge your money and keep, and whenever you want to make a transaction using that, you can use that Paytm wallet to make payments. Okay, so it is a version of physical or real life wallet, digital version of real life wallet, in which one can add money and purchase. Users can keep his or her money in the e-wallet and then use it whenever it is needed, that we already know. So what happens is this digital or mobile wallet stores bank account or debit card information or bank account information in an encoded format to allow secure payments. So used with merchants listed. Okay, so this you can basically make payments. That is what is given here. Okay. So here what happens is, with the help of this mobile wallets, it eliminates the need to use credit or debit cards, or even remember the CVV or 4-digit PIN. Okay, yes. Next, what we are going to study is Aadhaar enabled payment service. Aadhaar enabled payment service, or what we call as AEPS. And this is actually not yet launched in India. And I think this is soon at the verge of like coming up. Okay. So here what happened, like how earlier we were using a UPI ID or BPA, or we were using a phone number, or we were using MMID. Like this here, basically what they try to do is, they want some link to be created between two people, right? For the identification purpose. So one second, guys. Yes, sorry. So here what they basically do is that everybody has Aadhaar cards right now, right? So here they do Aadhaar based digital payment mode. That means one person who has the Aadhaar card and the other person who has the Aadhaar card, if both have their Aadhaar card numbers, using that itself, the money can be transferred from one person to another person. So his only need will be to have an Aadhaar number to pay to any purchase. So the money you pay will be deducted from your account and credited to the payee's account directly. So your Aadhaar will be linked to your bank account, and as and when you make payments, it will be deducted from your bank account. So this can be used for all banking transactions. Like if you, what you can do is, using this AEPS, you can inquire how much balance you have in bank. You can withdraw cash. You can deposit cash. You can make any payments, and Aadhaar to Aadhaar, you can do fund transfers also. So that is your AEPS. Next, you have something known as unstructured supplementary service data, USSD. Okay, so this basically what they say is, there might be areas where what happens is, basically internet connection or a smartphone might not be available. An internet connection or a smartphone might not be available. Okay, or actually this system basically does not need a smartphone or an internet connection. So this is basically like another name of USSD banking is star 99 hash banking. So here basically what they have to do is, they have to take up their mobile phone. It need not be a smartphone. Okay, just any random traditional mobile phone they can take, and they have to press star 99 hash. I think, I don't remember, you guys might have used this, and if you type number 1, it will show your balance detail, and if you take out number 1 and if you do number 2, it will show you like how much money you want to transfer. So basically what happens is that your mobile number will be linked to your bank account, and if this will act as your digital payment mode. Now if you press star 99 hash 1, it will show how much balance you have in your bank account. If you press star 99 hash 2, it will ask you how much money you want to transfer and to whom. So first you can type that 50,000 rupees is what you want to transfer, and when it asks to whom or what phone number you want to transfer, then you can basically type out that phone number and the money will get sent. So this is another way. Here the main point is that this does not need any smartphone or internet connection. Okay. So he or she can use it for financial and non-financial operations. Non-financial means, example, checking your balances. So that is a non-financial transaction. Okay, so that was about your unstructured supplementary service data, USSD. Next, you have your mobile banking. Mobile banking, I don't need to explain. Whatever I explained in internet banking, if that is done using a mobile app or using your mobile, then it will be your mobile banking basically. Okay, your example of a mobile banking app would be your YONO, the SBI one. Okay, yeah, so each bank, what it happens is, each bank has its own banking app or a own mobile app for its banking purpose, and the users of those specific bank can download these depending on whether they're using an Android or Windows or iOS, and depending on each software they would have developed one app, and that you can download and use it for your financial transaction needs. Got it? Next, so there are two more left, so I'll discuss it, and that's done. Okay, yes. Next, what you have is your cryptocurrency. So how many of you here have heard or have not heard of cryptocurrency? If you have heard, just put in a yes. If you have not heard, put in a no. Or I mean, you have heard but you don't know what it is. Basically, you have not heard of cryptocurrency. Others, anyone? You have heard? Others? Okay, yes. So I think the majority might have heard of it, but still I would like to explain it once again here in like a very layman language, because we don't need to go into deep. How much it's needed for the text purpose, I'll explain you. Okay. So there was this person. Okay, this person known as Satoshi Nakamoto. Okay, I am not very sure how his name is pronounced. Satoshi Nakamoto, there was this person. So what happened is, right now, you know that if somebody has to print money or somebody has to basically issue cash or print money, who has the power to? Okay, one second. I think the meeting is going to end in 2 minutes. I'll stop it right now and you all can join back again. So I would like to continue. So there was this person, okay. What were the topics that you taught in the morning class? So we had in the morning class, we had completed up to page number 4.50. Okay, before this digital payments, all the topics have almost been completed. Okay, yes. So what I was saying is, there was first I'll tell you in background that whenever any government has to, anyone has to, issue currency or cash or currency, who has the ultimate power to do that? The government has the ultimate power to do that. Okay, it is in the government's hand how much they want to issue or how much supply of money they want to have in the market. So this person, Satoshi Nakamoto, what he did was he gave a thought. He just, once said that why do we need to give this power or give this authority to government? Why cannot the money or the currency can be decentralized? Decentralized means that normally anybody could have the power to make money or issue money in general. Okay, so this was a thought that Satoshi Nakamoto stirred in the environment, and what happened is he then came up with a technology in 2009, and he issued a currency which was known as Bitcoin. So Bitcoin was first cryptocurrency. So I'll tell you what it is, you'll slowly understand. Okay, so he came up in 2009, he came up with this concept of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is nothing but it is a currency. Okay, but nobody has the power. Nobody has the power, like specifically here, you say that government has the power to issue currency like this currency. Nobody has like an ultimate power to issue it. Okay, so how is it issued or how is it work? In a light language, I'll tell you when it comes to. So what happens? Satoshi Nakamoto was successful in bringing a currency which was now not under the control of government. Correct. So what happened is, this is the reason, if cryptocurrency, you see, India has not yet legalized it or is not much accepting of it, or many countries in the world are right now not very much, accepting of cryptocurrencies, because what happens here is that cryptocurrency aims at making doing the decentralization of money. Now here, see, Indian government has the power, whatever it has, because it has the power to issue currency to us. If the government did not have the power of issuing currency to us, then it would hold no value. Correct. So because of that only they have power. Now if somebody is coming in, they're saying, and they'll take that power also, how will the government allow them? They'll not allow them, definitely, right? So that's the reason that it has not been legalized in many areas right now. So I'll tell you. So what Satoshi did was this, he came up with the concept of blockchain. The currency that he issued was known as Bitcoin. This is the currency name. It was issued in 2009. So he came up with the concept of blockchain. So here what happens is, basically there's a one very complex, like it is a very highly complex, okay, it is a highly complex, you can say in a way, a mathematical problem, which if you solve, If you solve, you will get 1 Bitcoin. If you solve that, you will get 1 Bitcoin. Okay, a new Bitcoin will be created if that complex issue is being, or a complex function basically, okay, it is being solved. Okay, I'll not go in detail, just take it that way. So this problem to be solved, it might eat up the entire electricity or entire energy of a whole city. Okay, that much energy and that much electricity it needs for taking up to solve one solve one basic complex problem. So here you need crores and crores of rupees of first infrastructure, that is your hardware, software, to first understand or have this problem with your hand, and then crores of money you have to spend on electricity also, so that you are able to solve this problem and then finally get a Bitcoin. So like this, as and when each person is going to solve it, one Bitcoin is going to be created, one Bitcoin is going to be created. Okay, so here what happens is this Bitcoin is now traded for the value of, so the value of 1 Bitcoin right now is 33 lakh rupees. The value of 1 Bitcoin right now is how much rupees? 33 lakh rupees. Okay. So here what happens is that, so here one thing that you have to remember is that this blockchain is there, no? This blockchain, it has the public financial transaction database. Public financial transaction database it has means, as and when each Bitcoin is being created, if suppose there are already 5 lakh Bitcoins, and if there is one new Bitcoin that is being created, this 5 lakh people who are the owners of those Bitcoins will be informed that a new Bitcoin has been created, and this 5 lakh, they'll be informed that now there is one more new Bitcoin created, and now the total number of Bitcoins is 5 lakh 1. But here one catch is that nobody will ever know who is the owner of that Bitcoin. So if there are 5 lakh, suppose there are 5 lakh Bitcoins, so 5 lakh 1 Bitcoins, people will know that there are 5 lakh 1 Bitcoins. Whoever are the owners of a Bitcoin, they will know that there are 5 lakh 1 Bitcoins in the market, but they will not know who holds how many Bitcoins or who holds a Bitcoin basically. Okay, so that is one concept, that it is very confidential, and what you can do is Bitcoins can be traded. Okay, from one person to another, you can trade it and make money basically. So here what they tell you is this ownership detail, which is there, who holds the Bitcoin basically. It is protected by a very strong cryptography. The encryption and all you would have heard, no? So it is using very strong cryptography. The ownership detail has been protected here. Okay. So here, so here what happens is that since there is so strong softwares and so strong cryptography, while you're selling the Bitcoin to one person, at the same time you cannot sell the Bitcoin to another person. That means you cannot spend the Bitcoin to another person. So your double spend cannot happen. Like how you can do is that, suppose in real life and all this is possible, you can make money, you can pay money to one person, and when he is turning that side, you can take the money from that same person and you will give it to another person. Like that, here double spend and all you cannot do, and nobody can actually counterfeit any Bitcoins. Okay, like then they cannot make a duplicate version of it. Like how you have duplicate cash, like this, a duplicate version cannot be made out of it. So this is basically an outline of Bitcoin. There is a lot more that you need to understand to basically get idea of it. So to understand the text which is given in the book, I explained you this. Okay. So basically what they are telling is this technology. Bitcoin was the first invented coin. After that, you have Litecoin. I think there are 2 to 3 more forms. Right now, there are a lot of other kinds of these coins. So here what happens is, now what they tell is the future is based on this blockchain technology only. The future is based on this blockchain technology. And in the future, the whole world is going to become one global space where there is only going to be one kind of currency. Okay. So here what they tell is cryptocurrency. So cryptocurrency, it is a digital currency produced by a public network. I already told you, rather than any government. Government does not make it. It uses cryptography to ensure that the payment are sent and received safely. Okay. So it is a medium of exchange. So basically cryptocurrency is also a digital mode of cash or something like that only, coins. So it is definitely has to act as a medium of exchange, where records of individual coin ownership are stored in a computerized database using strong cryptocurrency. I told you the ownership details are stored in a database, and it has strong cryptography so that it isn't leaked out. Okay, so what they tell is it is almost impossible to counterfeit or double spend. I already told you. Cryptography is completely decentralized. That means no servers are involved and there is no central controlling authority like how usually we have governments. Here, the payments can be made quickly and there will not be any transaction fee, or there will be very minimum transaction fees. Okay, so the first cryptocurrency was the Bitcoin, which was stop working. 1 second, guys. Just give me a second. Some issue. Yes, so we were here, right? So I was telling you that Bitcoin was the first cryptocurrency which was launched in 2009, and after that, other cryptocurrency have also come into the world: Litecoin, Purecoin, Namecoin, okay, Ethereum. All of these have now come right now into the world. Okay, so if you want to know more, you can Google it and get to know more. Okay, I think the battery is low, but I'll try to complete this last topic quickly. So how much charge do I have? 10%. I think we can work on it. Okay, fine. E-rupee. So this e-rupee is also a very different concept which has not yet come into play. So what they do here is they have a e-rupee. So what this e-rupee is, this e-rupee is like a voucher. How in Reliance Trends if you go, or if any shop Max or Pantaloons if you go, what happens is in that clothing store they will issue you a voucher and they'll tell you that this voucher is there. It contains 500 rupees. This is worth 500 rupees. So for buying any pair of jeans next time, you can use this voucher and buy it. Okay. So you have a voucher worth 500 rupees and they'll tell you the purpose that you for jeans only for buying jeans only you can use this voucher, and then you can use this voucher and basically get the benefits whatever is there out of it. The same way the e-rupee also works. So it is nothing but a e-voucher. So this is delivered to the beneficiaries in the form of a QR code or SMS stringed based voucher. Okay. Someone has sent me a text, but I did not understand. Fine. Okay. So this will either be in the form of a QR code which you can scan and take, or a SMS string voucher. This will be here. What will happen is this fund will directly be transferred to our bank account. Here, what they'll do is this e-rupees are usually released by the government, and the government will specify for what purpose you can use this. Example, now if they have told that government has told that we are sending 1,000 rupees, it is not there in your book. This topic is newly added, which is there from May 22 examination, but now you can just learn. Okay. So what they tell is, for the purpose, suppose government has told you that for the purpose of vaccination, we are going to give you 500 rupees in the form of e-voucher. So when a government gives you like this, that means you can only redeem it for that purpose only. You can redeem it only for that purpose only. Okay, so e-vouchers are basically, so e-rupees are nothing but e-vouchers for which it has a specific purpose, and amount of money is also being specified there. And for that specific purpose only, you can use it. Okay, so e-rupees is safe, easy, and secure, as the details of the beneficiaries are completely confidential. The required amount is already stored in that voucher itself, and any government agency or corporation can generate this e-rupee vouchers via their partner bank. Okay, so this was the concept of e-rupees, and with that we end our session on digital payments. Yes. So until now in this chapter, okay, so this chapter basically, if I have to divide, I would divide this chapter into 4 parts. One is e-commerce, then you have your m-commerce, your digital payments, and then your emerging technologies. We have already completed our e-commerce, m-commerce, and digital payments, and now we are going to start with our emerging technologies. So there are 10 types of technologies that we are going to read in this chapter, and each one of it is very interesting to study, and each one of us holds a good importance for you in the examination. So it is important that you understand each and every technology. Okay, So computing technologies is what we are going to study. So the first technology that we are going to study is something which is known as virtualization. Something which is known as virtualization. Okay. So virtualization, first virtualization, what does it mean? So in this chapter, you have to relate the word virtualization with the word imaginary. Something which is not there, but you imagine it to be there. So that is what is known as virtualization here. Okay. So before reading through the text, I'll give you one real life example and then we'll relate it to our concepts also. Okay. So what happens is when you would have first, if you would have seen this hostels and all, no, earlier in the hostel, if suppose a man created a hostel around like 10 years ago, he would have created one single room in which there would be one bed, and then there would be cupboards here and the walkway would be here. Okay. Now what happened is that as in when the years passed by, a lot of students started coming to his hostel and wanted to stay in his hostel. Now what happened was he did not want, or we can also say he did not have that much of money that he could buy 2 or 3 more hostels nearby. So what he did in his own hostel was that he worked smart. What he basically did was this same room itself, he took away all of these things and he created a partition between these rooms. He created a partition between the one single room that he already had. So in this, then he created 4 bedroom like a feeling. Okay. So here we will create 4 beds. So here what happened? Actually, this is one room only. But here he have put in a partition and created a feeling such that there are 4 rooms here and 4 different people can stay here and 4 different group of people can stay here. Okay. So this is basically what is virtualization also. Okay. So what is virtualization here is that, see, this is your traditional architecture and this is your virtualized architecture. So here in traditional architecture, what happens is you have this system, you have this base system. So on every system or on every CPU, you can only install one type of operating system. You can only install one type of operating system on it. So what are the different types of operating system? There might be Windows, iOS, Linux, then Unix and Android. So there are multiple types of operating system, but in one system, you could only install one type of operating system, and on that operating system, whatever apps used to work, you would install those applications on your operating system and work. Okay, so this was traditional. Now what happened is that now, as you all know, that there are different applications that work on different operating system. Now let's take a basic example. Okay, now if you take iTunes, so iTunes is one application. This iTunes, in which operating system does it work? Can someone tell me? iTunes, in which operating system does it work? Come on, quick. Let's answer this quickly. It works on iOS. Okay. So the same way, there is, suppose we will ourselves make one app. Okay. We'll make one app which only works on Android, suppose. Okay. This one app, suppose we'll name it Android X. Now this is one app which will only work on Android. Now what will happen? Users of Android phone will only be able to access this application, whereas users of iOS will only be able to access this application. So here there comes a divide. Now people who wants to use different application would need a different. If I need to use iPhone, I would need a phone. I would need an Apple phone which has iOS operating system. If I need to use a Android X application, then I would need a phone which supports Android operating system. Okay, so here what happens is, to solve this issue in companies, what they basically did was this, because one system could only install one operating system at a time. To avoid or to overcome this issue, what they did was this is one system, this is one particular system. So on this one particular system, rather than directly installing an operating software, they installed a software this, you can see they installed one layer, one extra layer they have put, and they installed one layer which was known as your virtualization layer. Basically, they installed one software which was known as virtual machine software. So basically, what this software did to the computer was that it created an illusion that there are different systems or different kinds of systems could work on one computer. That means basically different kinds of operating systems could be installed on one single computer or one single processor itself. Okay, so this is the software that we are talking about. This is nothing but your concept of virtualization. That means you install a software. The software name you would have heard of VMware. This is nothing but virtual machine software. Okay, so they install the software on a computer, and what happens is that this software gives the illusion or creates some imaginary environment where it makes the system believe that it can install different multiple operating systems. Okay, so now if you are able to install multiple operating system on one system, then according to that, whatever application you need, you will be able to install. Okay, you will be able to install on that. Suppose if there is one app which works on support of Windows, you'll install that. Then iOS, Linux, Unix, Android. Okay, so multiple operating systems you will be able to install, and depending on that, whatever app it supports and works best on it, you'll be able to install that. First, why did they bring in this concept is because if each system is only going to support one operating system, which is the reality. Okay, in general, if you don't have this virtualization software, that is how it is going to happen. Okay, so what happens is then they have to purchase a lot of systems to install multiple operating systems and multiple applications, correct? So to avoid this issue, basically, since it was getting as a very expensive process, they brought in this concept of virtualization. Is the concept of virtualization clear? So here what happens is, if suppose this is the base layer, and this base layer has a total hard disk area of 10 TB, and it has a RAM of 10 GB, suppose, what it is going to do is, so what it basically is going to do is, to each operating system and to each operating system, basically how much it would want to, allocate, it will allocate it. So for the first operating system, suppose it is Windows, it can allocate around 2 GB of RAM and 2 TB of hard disk space. Okay, so like this, then it will be left with remaining 8 TB of hard disk space and 8 GB of RAM. So this, then they can allocate to this and this depending on whatever the usage is. Whereas here, whole 10 GB of RAM would be taken up by this one operating system itself. Understood? So this is the concept. So what happens is, once you install this virtualization software or virtual machine software, it will ask you, it will give you like a drop down list of which operating system you want to install on your system, and you can install accordingly, and you can use different types of applications. Any doubt until this, guys? Just let me know. I'll be back in a minute. Okay, just give me a minute. Yes, guys. So sorry. So sorry, I just got a call. That's why. Okay. Yes. Now I think we can continue. Okay. 1 minute. Yep. Fine. So now we are going to read through the text. Now that you have understood what virtualization basically means, we are going to go through the text. Okay. Yes. So virtualization. So what is virtualization means here is that, is it not clear? Okay. So virtualization here means is that it means to create a virtual version of a device. It is creating a virtual version of a device. Here one more thing that I wanted to tell you was each of this operating system which is there, no, each of this operating system feels, it itself feels like it is an independent system in itself. Each of these feels like it is an independent system in itself. If Windows is downloaded first and then you have your iOS, maybe Android and so on, then each of the operating system is going to feel like it is the king and it is only occupying the whole space. Okay, so it creates an imaginary world where each of them, even though they are on a shared space, they think that they are independent softwares. Okay, so here these which are created, these 1 minute. Yeah, so these which are created, each of this is named as virtual machines. Each of these are named as virtual machines. Each of these are named as virtual machines. And the one layer which holds all of these machines together will be known as the virtual machine host. It is going to be known as your virtual machine host. Okay. So I have already told you, and there is this software which is in between, this software, this VMware or your virtualization layer or what we call as your virtual machine software. This basically creates a layer of abstraction. So what they call here is, see, this creates a layer of abstraction. Abstraction in the sense, it acts basically like your curtains, that a curtain is put over this actual hardware, and it seems like there are different or multiple hardwares here. There are different or multiple hardwares or systems here. Okay, so I hope you understood this concept. So here, read this and go to that. So in traditional days, what happens? Only one OS was installed in one machine. Or in case if the organization needed multiple software, what does it had to do? It had to, for every software, it had to, if it wanted different operating system, it had to purchase multiple machines, which was very, very expensive. Whereas in virtualization, what happens? Multiple operating systems, which is required for multiple softwares, can be installed in one particular machine itself with the help of what? With the help of virtual machine software. As an example of it is VMware. This is why organization could save the cost of expensive machines. So this is the brief. Okay. Yes. So virtualization means to create a virtual version of a device or a resource such as a server, a storage device, a network, or even an operating system. So now we saw the example of how operating system clubs with or connects with the concept of virtualization. The rest of the things we'll study later on. Okay, yes. So here what they say, it provides a layer of abstraction between the computer hardware systems and the softwares running on them. So I already told you that it creates like a this thing, this basically this virtualization layer which is there, it creates a layer of abstraction and it acts as a curtain basically, okay, between the hardware or that is the system and the software that is working upon it. Okay, so concept of virtualization. So concept of virtualization, the core concept of virtualization is partitioning only. That means there is one room and you partition it into multiple parts. Okay, so it divides a single physical server into multiple logical servers. One physical server will be there, but logically, if you see, there will be multiple servers. So once the physical server is divided, each logical server can run an operating system. So each logical server will be able to run different operating systems, correct? And applications independently. So independently, I already told you. Okay, next. So application areas of virtualization. So where and all can this virtualization be applied basically? So there is first, now we have understood one concept that there is one physical server and it is partitioned into multiple logical servers. Okay, but here there is one more concept. This concept is known as basically partitioning. There is one hardware And using on that one hardware, using the virtualization software, you create different virtual machines. Virtual machine 1, 2, and 3. This is basically known as partition. There is another side of virtualization, which is known as consolidation. So here what happens, you have different hardwares. You try to consolidate, or you try to, using the virtualization software, you try to create imaginary scenario where it feels like all these different hardwares which are there, it is just a single hardware. So the energy and the processing speed that all of these hardwares have, all this comes upon this one single hardware itself. So it becomes a very powerful hardware, correct? So this concept is known as consolidating. So both partitioning and consolidating, both are a concept of virtualization, but mainly focus would be on partitioning only. So in partitioning, what happens? It is one to many, whereas in consolidation, it is many to one. Okay. So application areas of virtualization, first is your server consolidation. So I just now told you, it consolidates many physical servers into fewer servers, which in turn host the virtual machines. So this is the host here. This is the host here, and it is hosting virtual other virtual machines. So this is known as physical to virtual or P2V transformation. Okay. Next is disaster recovery. So virtual machines can be used as a hot standby environment. Hot standby environment means spare environments. You call those spare parts, right? Spare. So what they are telling you is that if there are multiple if there are multiple logical units or logical servers, or multiple, if you have multiple virtual machines, basically here what happens is, if one virtual machine gets a hit, if suppose, one second, just give me a second. Okay. So here what they basically tell you is that if one particular virtual machine gets a hit, or any disaster happens to this one thing, the others or the rest of the applications and the OS will not get affected. Okay, so the disaster recovery is good here, correct? So virtual machines can be used as a hot standby or spare environment for physical production servers. Or else there is one more point of view here, is that in case if your main physical this unit gets disaster, then in another unit you can create logical units like these, and there you can use. So until then, this you can use as a spare part for the actual big this physical server. These logical servers can be used as a spare for the physical servers until the physical servers get get right. Okay. Next is testing and training. If there is anything that you want to test or you want to train, then you do not need to get multiple servers. Basically, in one server itself, since you have a lot of logical servers, what you can do is you can use it as a tester, that you can use one operating system and one application there and try to test it. So it can give a root access to a virtual machine, thus providing the testers an environment there where they can actually test the software on all possible configurations. Since you have multiple divisions in it, so all possible configurations you can try there. On a single hardware system itself, you can try everything. So if the virtual system crashes also, it will not affect the actual system, because it is just a virtual thing, correct? The actual or the real thing will not get affected. Okay, and within a few minutes, you can create a new virtual environment itself. Next is portable applications. So without installing it on a system's main disk drive, so without installing it on the main disk here, you can create virtual units, and there you can install it. So it is a portable application, so that each application is directly not installed on the machine. On a virtual space only it is installed. So that is portable application. The same way, portable workspace. Portable workspace means here when you create this different virtual machines. Okay, so when you create this different virtual machines, what happens is it can be moved across multiple computers without requiring repeated installation, customization, and data setup. Okay, so all of these things need not be there. Since it's virtual, one device to another device, you can easily move those virtual machines, and it need not be installed every single time or customized every single time. Correct. So these are the application areas of virtualization. First is you'll be able to do server consolidation, disaster recovery, testing and training, portable applications, and plus portable workspace. Both will be there. Next is next what you have is common types of virtualization. So there are three types of virtualization. One is hardware virtualization, network virtualization, and storage virtualization. Okay, so hardware virtualization was what I was already talking about. Okay, so there what happens is it creates a virtual machines that acts like a real computer with an operating system. So each virtual machine will act like independent computers with each having its own operating system. Correct. Software executed on these virtual machine is separated from the underlying hardware resources. So underlying hardware, whatever is there, from that this machines are being separated. This machine are being separated, and what is this layer called? This separating layer, what it is called? Can anyone tell me in the chat box? What is this separation layer called? Which separates the software that are there on the virtual machines from the actual hardware that is there below. Abstraction layer. Very good. It is known as your abstraction layer. Correct. Okay. Very good. Yes. So next what they're telling is the basic idea of hardware virtualization is to consolidate many physical servers into one large physical servers. I already told you that consolidation concept is also there. Okay, so the software that creates a virtual machine on the host hardware is called hypervisor or a virtual machine manager. I gave you the example of VMware, which is nothing but your virtual machine manager. There is another one which is known as hypervisor. It has another name which is known as hypervisor. That software which creates a virtualization space is known as your hypervisor and virtual machine manager. Okay, so that was about your hardware virtualization. The same way now networks can also be virtualized. That means one network, multiple computers can use. I'll give you one simple example. Now suppose there is one large network. Okay, so this what you create is you create a large network between different computers. Suppose there's computer 1, computer 2, computer 3, computer 4, and there's a printer in your office. You would have all noticed that in your offices, if you have ever been to office, there'll be one single printer which is there in the office, and all the other computers, they will share this printer. They will share this printer as they all of these computers and the printers will be connected over one network. So from computer 1, if you click on print, it will start getting printed on that main printing space. Okay, the same way if the computer 2 person also clicks it from his space itself, it will get printed here. So there will be one printer for the whole office, and how is it connected is all the computers will be connected to that one printer. So what happens is there will be one large network through which all these computers and these printers will be connected. This is nothing but you are combining all your resources. That means all computer 1, computer 2, 3, 4 and your printer. All these resources you are combining together by specifying by a specific network, by one specific network. So this is what is known as your network virtualization. So network virtualization is a method of combining the available resources, that is your computers and your printers, in the network by splitting up the available bandwidth into channels. So here what you do is basically you can if there is suppose a bandwidth of 200 mbps. So here what you can do is, first, what is bandwidth? Bandwidth is nothing but the amount of data that is carried per second. Okay, so this you can split up. Here you can provide the computer 1 with 2, computer 2 with 2 mbps. Like that you can split up this bandwidth among these shared network systems, and you can by splitting up the available bandwidth into channels, you can do this, and each of which is independent from others. So computer 1 will be independent from computer 2, computer 3 will be independent from the printer, and each of which can be assigned or reassigned to a particular server or device in real time. So if you want to shift the network, you do not want the printer to be any more connected to computer 4, then you can shift it. Correct. So this can also happen. So this allows a large physical network to be provisioned into multiple smaller logical units. So here what can happen is, one big network, you can connect it to multiple smaller units or multiple smaller network, or you can provision it into multiple smaller network, or multiple smaller network into one large network. That also you can do. So this way or that way, vice versa, you can do the network virtualization. Okay. And finally, what you have is storage virtualization. So all of you will have a mobile phone, definitely, right? Each one of you must be using your mobile phones. So what happens is that in your mobile phone, that is in your mobile, what happens is when you open your gallery, there'll be multiple pictures. You will have multiple pictures, correct? So if you want to suppose you want to view this picture, okay, so this is a picture of a cute dog that you have kept in your phone, and you want to, if suppose, view this picture. What will happen is this particular picture can be stored anywhere on your phone. It can be either stored in your memory card, or it can be stored on the Google Drive, or it can be stored in your internal memory. Correct. The mobile will not come and ask you whether where it is stored, where should I go and access it. It will directly, whenever you click on the picture itself, so wherever it has been stored, there it will go and access and get you that picture and come. So this is nothing but storage virtualization. That what happens is one particular picture or one particular data, it can be stored over many networks. It can be stored over many networks or over any network. Correct. So here storage virtualization is pooling of data from multiple storage devices. So from multiple storage devices, your Google Drive, your internal memory, your SD card. So from multiple storage devices, you pool in the data, even different types of storage devices, into what appears to be a single device. So inside your one gallery, you've pulled in all the data from multiple storage devices, and that is managed from a central console. Okay. So what does storage virtualization help you in? It helps the storage administrator perform the task of backup, archiving, recovering more easily in less time by disguising the actual complexity of a storage area network. So it will help you in archiving your photos. It will help you in taking backup of it. If anything is lost, recovery of it will be more easier. So all of these advantages you have when you do storage virtualization. So what were the three common types of virtualization? Hardware virtualization, network virtualization, storage virtualization. Then we also had studied the application areas of virtualization and the concept of it. So that's it for today's, this session. So let's start with the session, guys. So in this session, we are going to learn the concept of grid computing. Okay. Yes. So here in grid computing, 1 minute. Yes. So here in grid computing, what they basically tell you, what the concept of grid computing is, we'll understand through a small story first. Okay. So what happens, we'll take one of the people from our class, we'll take the example of Priya. Okay. Now just imagine that Priya is a very big scientist bar doctor. Okay. She is a very big scientist bar doctor. Okay. Now what she has to do is, now she has thought that she would make a research on dengue. Because now you all know in this season, dengue is affecting a lot of people, right? So she has thought that she would right now do a research, a very, very complex and a very big research that no one ever has done before. Not, let's take the example of cancer, to maybe dengue and cancer. On these two aspects, she wants to perform a research. Okay. So what she does is that for this kind of research, it is very, very complex. It involves huge amount of data. It involves a huge amount of processing. So what happens is, she decides that she would, to do such amount of processing and research, she would need a supercomputer. What would she need? She would need a supercomputer. Okay. So now what she decides is that she herself has only a laptop with her. So she gets to know that with the processing power the laptop has, or the storage, RAM and all of that, keeping in mind, a normal laptop, a basic laptop, would not be able to perform those functions. So she goes to the marketplace, and in the marketplace she goes to decides and goes to buy the supercomputer. So when she goes to the marketplace and asks the shopkeeper who is there for this supercomputer, he tells the price, and that comes as a super big shock to Priya, that he tells the price of one supercomputer would be around 20 crores. Okay, she in her bank account would not even have 1 crore of rupees. Now, where is she going to get this 20 crore rupees from, right? So when she thinks and thinks, and she says that she do not want to, stop this research, or stop this research or this processing just in between with just an idea. She wants to actually make this research a reality. So what she basically does is that she comes against a concept. Okay. And that concept is what is known as your grid computing. So what now grid computing tells you is that, okay, so now this is grid computing. So what grid computing tells Priya is that, see, We understand that you cannot get a supercomputer because one, the supercomputer is very, very expensive and it is not affordable by you. But the research that you're doing would also not be possible to do on a normal computer or a normal laptop. So you need something which contains enormous power, but at the same time does not cost you as much as a supercomputer. So what this grid computing says is that, so it tells you that what Priya, what you can do basically is, I have heard that since you are a doctor, come you are a scientist, there are a lot of people in your community. One second. This, okay. Yeah, okay. So there are a lot of people in your community. Okay, so now we'll just for imagine, suppose Priya has around 100 doctors as a friend and around 60 scientists as a friend. So this computes about totally 160 people. Okay, so she in total has around 160 people who knows her, and all these 160 people have their laptops or have their own set of computers or laptops. So what this idea basically suggests is that, see, this 100 people, okay, this 100 doctors would not be using their laptop 24/7. They would not be using their laptop or using their PC 24/7. So what you can do is, whenever these 160 laptops or 160 systems are basically idle, whenever they are idle, what you can do is you can use this idle time of that laptop or idle time of that PC, and you can use the resources that are available in the laptop whenever the laptop is going to be idle. So resources in laptop, what are the resources that Priya can use from this laptop is the processing power that it has, the storage power that it has. So different kinds, the RAM, all of these, what Priya can use whenever their systems are idle, and they would not deny also, correct? So Priya comes to conclusion that to perform this research, what she is going to do is, she is going to go to these 160 people and she is going to explain the idea that she has to this 160 people and tell them that, see, whenever your laptops or whenever your personal computers are idle, you can let me know. It can be either in the morning or in the night. Okay, you can let me know, and at that time what I am going to do is, I am going to use the power. I am going to use your laptop's resources for my benefit and do the and perform the research. So what happens is, Priya might at one point of time have around 60 to 70 computers processing powers which she can use in her own laptop, and with using this power, this is like an equivalent to a supercomputer's power, even though this is being obtained virtually, correct? So these people they do not need to go and give this laptop to her. What these people need to do is that, these 160 people, what they need to do is that basically they can just open their laptop and keep, and they will connect it to the internet or any network which Priya tells them to connect with, and using that network connection itself, Priya will connect these laptops to her single laptop. So this laptop, which was just a piece of normal laptop or a basic laptop, is now being turned into a supercomputer with the help of the concept of grid computing. So I hope now you have understood what grid computing means. So here, as you can see, there is one person or one scientist who wants to do a lot of processing work. So different people lend their resources or lend their laptops or PC, and that she uses in this device to perform the functions that she wants to perform. So here, as you can see, if you see this picture, what does it depict? That everybody from anywhere in the world, they can share their resources which are basically idle and give it to the people who are in need. Okay, so now basically below are attached, I just took the screenshots right now. So these screenshots are a screenshot of a website which is the grid, which is a, why is this not working, gridrepublic.org. Okay, is any desk an example of grid computing? No. See, any disk you can use anybody else's computer to watch and basically see what's happening in their computer. If you want to get some information or you want to remotely use their computers, you do this. Here, any disk is not an example of grid computing. Why? Number one, grid computing. So I'll explain this and then move on to the concept. So what happens is when you are using basically a grid computing concept, number one is you only use grid computing when you have a very super complex problem or super complex processing that is needed. Okay, so what you basically do is there are two kinds of grid computing itself can be bifurcated into two. One, what you do is you have your laptop. There is suppose around a lot of tasks to be performed to complete that research. So what you can do is there will be a lot of networks which are connected to your laptop, correct? So what you can basically do is each task, what each of the computers needs to get completed, you can allocate it to those computers or laptop through the network. And once these mini computers, which are laptops or computers which are connected to you through network, these all will complete whatever tasks were given to them, and you can then finally collect the output whichever has come and use it for your research. This is one kind of grid computing. Another kind of grid computing is where what you do is you have your laptop. Okay, laptop, yeah. So you have your laptop, and here you do not delegate the work to those, you do not basically split up those work and give to them. Here what you do is you use all of their resources in the right sense, and you take all of their power, and that whole power comes into your laptop, and then you process one function or you perform a complex function, and that by that you get an output. Whereas this does not happen in the case of any disk. Any disk you do not use to perform any first complex problems or anything like that, and plus you cannot use someone's. Here at the same time you will be able to use your own laptop's resources also and their laptop's resources also. There will be 500 more laptops resources or storage power that you are using along with your own laptop storage power. So here we'll take I'll give you one example. Suppose your laptop has a processor i7. Okay, so there is your laptop has a processing of i7. This laptop might be i3 laptop. This might be i5 laptop. This must be AMD processor laptop. So like that. Okay, so you might have different laptops. So basically all these processing power, to the extent they can get it for themselves, all these processing power will come here. And it will not any longer be just an i7 laptop, and it will have more processing power. Correct? So this is how basically a grid computing works. I hope you would have understood this. Yes. So now what I was talking about is the Grid Republic a website. Okay, so here this is the website. I had opened it and I had opened like what they do page. And here what they tell you is that Grid Republic plugs you into a novel form of digital philanthropy, volunteer computing. So here what you do, you volunteer your computers. So what you just need to do to use this grid computing is whoever wants to volunteer and give their laptops, what they need to do is they basically would need to install a software. They would basically need to install a software which will make it possible to lend your PC spare processing power. Here what they're basically doing is they're doing a study on cancer, AIDS, malaria, and climate change and all of those vital causes. So basically first you need to install a software which they'll give you so that your becomes a virtual, a computer which can be virtually lent out. So here by aggregating the idle resources from large number of volunteers, we collectively create virtual supercomputers. What do they create? Virtual supercomputers. So what they tell you, see, this is the main point here, and you had asked me, for related to any disk. See, this is the point. So computations that would take tens of thousands of years to run on an ordinary machine can be processed in just a few months using this technology. Okay. So here this was the brief about grid computing, and here they have given you like if you go what you can do is you can go on to this website, you can choose a project for which you would want to lend your laptop, and after you have chosen a project, so here there are different kinds of project like world climate, you have Then you have for protein related diseases, nanomagnetic molecules, protein structures. So for different kinds of studies or research, they use this. You can go choose the project, and for that they'll tell you to install a software in your device. Once you have installed the software, whenever you are available, I think you can, whenever your laptop is idle, you can basically put in the timing, like when your laptop will be idle. And at that time, you just need to keep your basically that screen and the software open, and they will use your laptop's resources via internet or network connection. Here, in return, what you would get is some amount of money as rent for renting the laptop to them. Okay. So any doubts in grid computing, a concept as such, guys? Any doubts in that? If there is anything, let me know. Okay. Yes. So what is grid computing? Grid computing is a computer network in which each computer's resources are shared with every other computer in the system. So there'll be one computer, and suppose there are like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Suppose we have 6 computers. So what happens is it forms a network between all of these computers, and the resources of one computer is basically shared with all other computers too. Okay, so this is a distributed architecture. As you can see here, it is distributed among all the systems. So it is a distributed architecture of large number of computers connected to solve a complex problem. Okay, so here what and all can be shared is, you can share your processing power, your storage, your RAM, and different things like that. What they tell you next is that servers or personal computers run independent tasks. So these are actually independent devices only. These perform independent tasks also, but they are also linked by internet or low speed networks, and this can also be regarded as individual laptops. And secondly, for the purpose of grid computing, they are also linked to each other through a network. Okay, yes. Next, they are talking about what are the benefits of grid computing. So first benefit of grid computing is it makes use of underutilized resources. If I have got a laptop and my laptop is like in 24 hours a day, around 4 hours only I use my laptop. The rest 20 hours, if it is if it is like idle, then the resources of my laptop are not getting properly utilized. So it provides a framework for you for exploiting this underutilized resources. Okay, so you can provide them on rent to the other person, and they will use this resources. Correct? Why waste it? Next is resource balancing. So here what happens is that if there are, suppose one computer, I have this i7 here, I think I gave you the example. No? Yeah. Okay. So here, 1 minute. Okay, better. Yes. So you have this laptop. So what you do is you have assigned a few tasks to all of these computers. Okay. So here what happens is suddenly i3, the amount of task that you have given to i3 suddenly feels that the task is very huge and very complex for it to handle. So what in such case you can do is you can, this i3 can share this task with i5 or this AMD one. So it can basically, this resources can do the planning in itself, and it can share its resources if the work is too much peak high. Now this i5, what happens is it needs some more processing power to process one complex maybe a problem. So what i5 can do is it can take i3's resources for some time and use it. Okay, so this only they are telling here. So in resource can be balanced. So at the time of unexpected peaks, that there is a lot of workload, it can be routed to relatively idle machines on the grid. So the machines on the grid, whichever machines are a little bit even more idle or does not have that much processing work, you can share it to them. So this is the second benefit. Third is parallel CPU capacity. So if there are like computer 1, computer 2, computer 3, computer 4, all these 4 computers would have its own CPUs, correct? Or its own processing units. So here what happens is that since so many processing units are coming together at one time, what happens is you can finish the task that you would do suppose in like 50 hours in just 1 hour, correct? So it finishes in 1/10 of the time if it uses the 10 times of numbers of processor. If you would have used one processor, you would have done it in 50 hours. Now, since you're using here 10 processors, you would just do it in 1 hour or maybe 5 hours. So it just takes 1/10 of the time if it uses the 10 times the number of processors. Okay. Next is virtual resources and virtual organizations for collaboration. So what happens is a lot of people here come together to share their resources and collaborate together on a similar purpose. Correct. Fine. Next is access to additional resources. So here what happens is that other than, in addition to CPU and storage, which you're going to share, apart from these resources, a grid can also provide access to other resources. You can take processing power and storage. Other than that, there are even more resources that you can take from other computers. What are those other? The computation power, the network, the storage, all these also you can use. Next is reliability. So here what they are telling is, since these computing systems are very high-end and conventional, they use some expensive hardware to increase reliability. So what happens is that even when one computer shuts off, the other computers can take up the job and be ready to do it. Okay, so here, so this is why grid computing is reliable. Even if one is going to go off, the others will be able to handle it. Next is better management. So here what they are telling you is, when you in the grid, you have a lot of resources with you. So you need to prioritize what task you have to give to which resources and how they are going to perform it. So how you are going to manage the priorities among different projects, you have to decide. So these are the benefits. So first is that you make use of underutilized resources. Then you will be able to balance the resources. You will have a lot of CPU capacity. Then you will be able to collaborate. You can access additional resources. It will be reliable and it will be a better management. Okay. Yes. So I hope you understood that. Next is, after benefits of grid computing, the next thing that we are going to understand are the types of resources. So types of resources means, what you can do is, what kind of resources can be used while grid computing. Like I told you, you can do processing, you can do storage, you can take the storage space of some other device. Like that, what are the other resources that can be used while you do this grid computing? So first one, what you can use is the computation. Computation means nothing but the CPU, the processing that I already told you. So the most common resource is computing cycle. So the most common shared resource in this grid computing system is your computation, means nothing but your CPU, the processing power. Okay. So here what you can basically do is that, see, in grid computing, what is there is, you have a network of suppose 10 computers. Example, in your grid computing network, you have a network of how many computers? 10 computers. Okay, so what you do is, there is one heavy task which needs around 10 hours on one computer. You need to spend on one computer, you need to spend around 10 hours to complete that task. But now, since you have grid computing, what you can do, the same task can be divided among these 10 computers and it will get completed in just 1 hour. The same way, if you have to test some software, if you have to test this software, that software testing needs to be done for suppose 100 times, you have to test one software. But now if you have grid computing, you will test it over a network of 10 computers, and each computer, if it tests itself 10 times, it is more than enough. Okay. Yes. So there are 3 ways to exploit the computation resource of a grid. First, what you can do is, the application, okay, whatever you want to run, that rather than running on your own machine, you can run it on the grid where a lot of other computers are also available. Then what you can do is, if there is any work, this example that I told you first, okay, this you can split your work and use separate parts to execute it. Like in the work, you can split the work into suppose 10 parts, and each part you can assign to one computer on the grid and they can do it for you. Next is, why they execute many times. It is an example of this testing software. So here what they're telling is, if there is something that has to be executed a lot of times, suppose here there is a software testing that you have to do for 100 times, then it can be done on many different machines, which should make the task easier for you. So computation is one of the resources which is being shared on grid. Okay, next is storage. As you all know, this is the second most common resource. Here what happens is, each machine, that is each laptop which is being lent for grid computing, The on the grid usually provides some quantity of storage for grid use. So for grid use, it will provide some quantity of storage from its side, even if it is temporary. So for some time, you can store your data there also and keep. Okay, so storage can be memory attached to the processor, or it can be secondary storage. So either it can be the laptop's memory, or it can be secondary storage memory also. Okay, so storage also is being shared in grid computing. Next thing that is being done is communications. So since there are a lot of computers that are, attached or connected through this network, it needs good communications, or what we say, it needs good network, or it needs, we can say it would need good internet or bandwidth, so that it is able to communicate with each other, and the person who is doing it, he or she will be able to easily send the jobs what these laptops or computers have to do, and the required data, these all can, once the processing is over, can give it back to the system. Okay, so that is your communication. So that communication means your networks, your bandwidth, all of these should also be good, and these are also a part of the resources that is being provided. Okay, next is softwares and licenses. So here basically, here what happens is that what they tell you is, suppose you have three kinds of software here. Okay, so you first have purchased, you have installed, and then you run it. So if there is a software, you first purchase it, then you install it, and then you run it on your computer. Suppose there is one software which you have installed. This one software this one software you have purchased. The one software that you have purchased right now can only be installed in one device, and it can also be only run on that same device in which it was installed. This is one kind. This example you can take for this software. The example would be your video lectures. One second, guys. Sorry, your pen drive classes. Okay, so it is one software you install on your phone, on your laptop. It is installed on, can be only installed in one device, and then the running also on the same laptop only you can run it, correct? Then there is one more kind of software, which it is one software only, but it can be installed in multiple devices, and it can be run on multiple devices also. It can be installed in multiple devices and can be run on multiple devices also. There is third kind of software. This software, what happens is, you purchase it. This can be installed on multiple systems, but can be only run at one system at a time. A good example to this would be your Netflix account or your Amazon Prime account. Okay, so you have installed it in multiple phones or multiple watch areas, but it can only be watched one at a time. Like at one device only you'll be able to watch it. So the third one is the best amongst the three. It is more flexible, if you can see. Correct. So here that only they're talking that software and licenses. Software installed that may be too expensive to install on every grid machine. So here it will be. So here what they are telling is, some software licensing arrangements permit the software to be installed on all the machines of a grid. So what happens is, there might be a software which can be installed on all the machines of a grid, but it may limit the number of installations that can be simultaneously used at any given instant. That means at one instant only few will be able to use that software. So software also can be shared over the network. It will be shared with everybody. Everybody can install it, but only a few people will be able to use it. Correct. Final, what you use for grid computing is a special equipment, capacity, architecture, and policy. So basically, this is nothing but the different kinds of resources that you use in grid computing. So you can use maybe a criteria to assign job to each machine. So suppose what you can do is, if you have got like around 20 computers for the grid, then you can assign the criteria that first 5 computers will be used for medical research only. Next 15 computers shall be used for education research. So things like that. Okay, so what were these? These were your types of resources that are involved in a grid computing environment. These are the types of resources which are involved in a grid computing environment. Okay, so now we finally move on to our last topic, which is application areas of grid computing. So where and all is this grid computing used? First, I told you scientific research. I've already told you that in the areas of scientific research, they use it. Next, in the film industry also, they use it to give special effects in a movie. So if you have seen this BTS of behind the scenes of either Avengers movie or of Bahubali and movies like that, They have a lot of amazing visuals that run in the background, the waterfalls, the lake, the jumping, the buildings, all of that, right? So all of this is actually not real. They just have a plain green screen in the background, and on in front of that they act. And what finally they do is the person who edits the video will put the graphics behind it or give special effects to it. So this and all, when a movie is made, these are very, very complex editings that has to be done, and it cannot be done on just a basic laptop. Do you think Avengers movie you will be we do video editing on your laptop? No, it is not possible. In that case also, for doing that or giving the special effects, in film industry also they use the concept of grid computing. Next is in financial industry. So what happens is people who are very much into finance, they would forecast what a particular stock's future would look like. To forecast what a particular stock's future is, they do a lot of analysis, right from the company's data to what people are saying, to what product they are selling, what will be the business trend in the next few years, how is the stock market reacting, what are the other conditions that is going to affect the product, the business, or the stock market. Umpteen number of researchers they have to do to predict this. So all of this cannot be possible on our laptops, basic laptops or basic computers. So for this also they use grid computing. Next is insurance companies. So insurance company, what they do is they collect data, they mine data from their partner hospitals for fraud detection. Okay, so for that also an insurance company can also use grid computing. And finally, the civil engineers, what do you think civil engineers basically do? They just draw and give you a no. So what they have to do is, if suppose example, when they are doing this earthquake engineering, okay, that means they have to see how a building can be made that even when an earthquake is coming, it would still be very strong and would have a very good grip on the ground. So for that, they would have to do experimental research of design. They have to execute it. They have to analyze it. They have to validate different models. So this is also a very huge task. So for that also they use grid computing. So these were a few examples of where grid computing can you see. All these questions, all these topics have been already asked in exam as questions. So don't leave any area as choice. From anywhere you can get questions. Okay. We have one final topic left, which is grid computing security. So this topic I'll take tomorrow along with when I'm taking the cloud computing concept. Okay. So that's it for today's class, guys. I hope there is no doubt that you have in grid computing, and everything is like properly clear to you. At least the concepts are very much clear to you.
So yes guys, we have come towards the end of the video. So this was a part 2 and the part 3 will be releasing soon. So yes, I hope you found the video helpful. In case if you did, please make sure to like, share and also subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to leave your feedback in the comment section below, and I'll meet you in the next video guys. Thank you.